The call came from inside room 307 at exactly 2:13 a.m. The voice on the line was controlled at first, low, measured, almost as if the man was trying not to wake someone. But then he said something that didn't fit. Not a complaint, not a request, just a statement that made no sense at all. There's someone else in here. The front desk employee checked the system immediately. No duplicate key issued. No second guest registered. The room had only one occupant, but before the employee could respond, the man spoke again. This time quieter, closer to the receiver, like he was afraid of being overheard. They're standing in the corner. They haven't moved since I woke up. Security was dispatched within minutes. The hallway outside room 307 was empty, silent in a way that didn't feel natural. No distant footsteps, no elevator hum, no muffled televisions behind closed doors. Just stillness, the kind that presses against your ears. They knocked. No answer. They called the room. No answer. Then they tried the handle. Locked from the inside. That's when one of them leaned closer to the door and said he could hear something faint. Not movement, not breathing. Just a sound that didn't belong to the hallway. They used the master key. The lock disengaged, but the door didn't open. It resisted. Not like something heavy was blocking it, not like furniture pushed against the frame. It felt wrong, like the space on the other side wasn't aligning with the space outside. They pushed harder. The door shifted slightly, just enough to let a thin strip of light spill into the corridor. And for a moment, just a fraction of a second, one of the guards later claimed he saw movement inside the room. Not crossing the space, but correcting itself, like something had been in the wrong position and then snapped into place. They stopped pushing after that, not out of protocol, out of hesitation. When the police finally forced the door open, the room was empty. No second person, no sign of forced entry, no disturbance. The bed untouched, the windows sealed, the bathroom dry. There was no possible way for anyone to leave without being seen. And yet, the man who made the call was gone. Completely. No belongings, no identification, no trace he had ever been there. Except for one detail written in the margins of the report, later removed from the official file. Mirror shows inconsistency. The mirror was replaced 2 days later. No record of where the original went. And the case was archived. I didn't find this case the way most stories are found. There was no headline, no public record, no clear trail leading to it. It wasn't even stored where it should have been. I came across it buried inside a set of archived maintenance logs. Documents no one reads unless they're looking for something specific. And at first, it didn't stand out. Just another reference to a room number. Another note about a replacement. Another routine entry. But the deeper I went, the more I realized something wasn't right. Pages were missing. Sections were cut. Entire reports referenced, but never included. It wasn't just incomplete. It felt intentionally reduced. Like someone had taken the original story and removed only the parts that mattered. The Ashford Grand Hotel doesn't appear in most databases anymore. You can search for it, and you might find fragments. Old listings, outdated photos, a mention in a travel forum from years ago. But nothing consistent. No closure report. No public investigation. No explanation for why a fully operational hotel would shut down overnight and never reopen. And yet, when you trace the internal records, one detail keeps resurfacing. Quietly, repeatedly, almost like it wasn't supposed to be noticed, but couldn't be completely erased. Room 307. The same room tied to complaints that didn't make sense, maintenance requests that were never resolved, and one incident that never made it into the official version of events. On this channel, we don't follow the stories that are easy to explain. We go through what was left behind, the reports that were cut short, the details that don't align, and the moments investigators couldn't account for. So before we go further into this case, take a second to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Your city and country. Because the more I looked into this one, the more it felt like something that wasn't meant to stay buried. And what happened inside room 307 wasn't just a disappearance. It was something that doesn't behave the way it should. I drove out to where the Ashford Grand Hotel used to be just before sunset. Not because I expected to find anything, but because I needed to understand the space. The location still exists technically. The road is there. The turnoff is there. Even the outline of the building remains, though most of it has been stripped down to concrete and exposed framework. But what struck me wasn't what was left. It was what wasn't. No signage, no fencing, no indication that something had ever operated there. It felt less like an abandoned structure, and more like something that had been removed piece by piece until only the shell remained. And as I stood there, looking at what used to be the entrance, I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't reconstructing a place. I was trying to remember something I had never seen. The original building opened in 1989, positioned just far enough off the highway to attract travelers without becoming part of the noise. 5 floors, 87 rooms, a layout designed for efficiency, not comfort. The kind of place people stayed in for a night and forgot by morning. But internally, it operated differently. I know that because I found the logs, the ones that weren't meant to be archived with the public records, staff rotations, maintenance requests, handwritten notes that never made it into the system. And buried inside those documents was a pattern that didn't belong. Not at first glance, not something obvious, but something that repeated just enough to leave an impression once you noticed it. The first reference to room 307 wasn't marked as unusual. It appeared in a maintenance log from late 2003, something minor. A request to check the lighting fixture. 2 days later, another entry. Same room. Electrical issue unresolved. Then again and again. Within 3 months, room 307 had more maintenance activity than every other room on the 3rd floor combined. But none of the reports explained what was actually wrong, just variations of the same phrase. Issue unresolved. That alone would have been enough to flag it. But what made it worse was that the room never went out of service. It kept being assigned, over and over again. I found guest notes next. Short, inconsistent, easy to dismiss on their own. One requested a room change at 1:40 a.m., stating that the layout felt wrong. Another complained about reflections, not broken ones, not distorted, just incorrect. One entry stood out more than the others. No name attached, no signature, just a line written across the bottom of a page. There was someone in the mirror that didn't move when I did. It wasn't escalated, it wasn't investigated, it was filed like everything else. But by that point, the pattern wasn't subtle anymore. It was just ignored. The more I read, the more I started noticing something else. Something that didn't belong in the reports themselves, but in how they were written. The language shifted when room 307 was mentioned. Normally, entries were precise, technical, efficient, but anything tied to that room felt hesitant, incomplete, words crossed out, sentences left unfinished, like whoever was documenting it didn't fully trust what they were seeing, or didn't want to commit it to record. And then there were the gaps, entire pages missing between dates where activity should have been logged, not random gaps, specific ones, always surrounding that room. I went back through the floor plan after that. Not the public version, the internal one, the kind used for maintenance and inspection. That's where I noticed it. The spacing between room 306 and room 308 wasn't consistent. Not by much. A few inches, maybe less. easy to overlook unless you were measuring, but it was there. A discrepancy that shouldn't exist in a standardized layout. I checked older versions. Same thing. The gap was always present, but never acknowledged, and for a moment I thought it was just an architectural error, a misprint, something insignificant. But then I remembered the reports, the reflections, the complaints, and the fact that the only object consistently mentioned in that room was the mirror. I didn't find his name in the system. That was the first inconsistency. Every guest who checked into the Ashford Grand should have had a digital record, ID verification, payment method, timestamp. But for January 12th, 2004, there was a gap. Not a corrupted entry, not a formatting error, just absence. The kind that doesn't happen by accident. I had to go back to the handwritten logs, the ones staff used when the system was slow or offline. That's where I found it, a single line written quickly, like it wasn't meant to stand out. DH Cash, room 307. No last name, no address, no ID reference, just initials. And a room number I was already too familiar with. According to the timeline, he checked in just after midnight. No luggage, no requests, no interaction beyond the transaction itself. That alone wasn't unusual. Places like that see all kinds of guests. People passing through, people avoiding attention, people who don't ask questions. But there was one detail that didn't match the pattern. He didn't get assigned room 307. He asked for it, specifically. The front desk noted it in passing, like it didn't matter. But when you look at everything else, the prior complaints, the maintenance logs, the repeated issues, it becomes impossible to ignore. He didn't end up in that room by chance. He chose it. The next recorded activity didn't come from housekeeping or from staff observation. It came from the phone system. At 2:13 a.m., a call was placed from room 307 to the front desk. The recording wasn't preserved, but the written account was. I read it more than once, trying to understand what kind of situation would lead someone to describe it the way he did. The employee who took the call didn't write it like a complaint. There was no request for assistance, no mention of noise or discomfort or another guest. Just a sentence transcribed as closely as possible. There's someone in here. Not someone came in. Not I hear someone. Someone already inside. What came next is where the tone changes. You can see it in the way the employee wrote the rest of the statement. The structure breaks. The sentences shorten. There's hesitation in the phrasing, like they weren't sure how to record what they were hearing. The guest didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. If anything, that made it worse. He spoke quietly, controlled. He said the person was standing in the corner, not moving, not responding, just there. And then, after a pause, he added something that doesn't fit into any normal explanation. Something that wasn't repeated anywhere else in the file, but was written down exactly once. They look like me. Security was sent up within minutes. That part is standard. 2 guards, both with access keys, both trained to handle situations like this. But the report they filed afterward wasn't standard. They described the hallway as unusually quiet. Not empty, quiet. The kind of silence that feels deliberate. They knocked. No response. They announced themselves. Nothing. Then they tried the handle. Locked. From the inside. They called the room again while standing outside the door. No answer. And then one of them did something that wasn't in protocol. He leaned in, closer to the door, and listened. What he wrote down later is short, but specific. There was a sound, not from the hallway, not from behind the walls, from inside, but not moving. They used the master key. The lock disengaged immediately. That part worked. But when they tried to open the door, it didn't respond the way it should have. It didn't feel blocked by anything solid. There was no resistance like furniture pushed against it. It felt misaligned, like the space behind the door wasn't matching the frame it was supposed to open into. They pushed again, harder this time. The door shifted slightly, just enough to let a narrow line of light cut through the gap. And in that moment, one of the guards reported seeing movement, not crossing the room, not approaching the door, just adjusting, like something inside had been in the wrong position and corrected itself the second the door moved. They stopped trying after that, not because they couldn't open it, but because something about it told them they shouldn't. By the time the police arrived, the hallway had already been cleared. Guests on that floor were quietly moved to other rooms without explanation, and the section around 307 was isolated. I know that because the relocation log still exists, one of the few documents that wasn't altered. What stood out to me wasn't the relocation itself, but how quickly it happened. No escalation report, no supervisor approval logged, just immediate action, as if whoever made the decision didn't want anyone else near that door any longer than necessary. When the officers stepped into the corridor, they weren't walking into an unknown situation. They were stepping into something that had already unsettled everyone who had seen it before them. The first thing noted in the police report wasn't the door, or the call, or the missing guest. It was the temperature. Subtle, but measurable. The closer they stood to room 307, the more the air seemed to drop. Not dramatically, not enough to fog breath or trigger alarms, but enough to be written down by someone who normally wouldn't bother. It's the kind of detail that doesn't mean anything on its own, but in context, it becomes harder to ignore, because nothing else on that floor showed the same variance. Just that section, just that door, and just enough to make one officer pause before reaching for it. They attempted entry the same way security had. Master key first. The lock disengaged immediately. No mechanical failure, no obstruction. But the door still resisted. Not completely, just enough to feel wrong. One officer described it later as opening into the wrong space. That phrase doesn't appear in the official report, but it was preserved in a secondary note, the kind that doesn't get filed unless someone thinks it matters. They forced it open on the second attempt. The door gave way slowly, like it was adjusting as it moved, not just swinging on its hinges. And when it finally opened far enough to see inside, everything looked normal. The lights were on. The bed was undisturbed. No signs of movement, no overturned furniture, no evidence of a struggle. The bathroom door was open, dry clean. The window was sealed from the inside, with no indication it had been tampered with. There was nowhere for anyone to hide, nowhere for anyone to leave. And yet the room was empty. Completely. The kind of empty that doesn't feel like absence, but like something had been there and was no longer visible. That's the detail that doesn't appear in the report. But it shows up in the wording, in the hesitation, in the way multiple officers describe the space without ever using the same language twice. Then they noticed the mirror, mounted on the wall opposite the bed, positioned so that anyone standing near the entrance would see themselves immediately upon entering. Standard placement, standard size, but something about it didn't align. At first, it was subtle, something you wouldn't catch unless you stayed still long enough. One of the officers did exactly that. He stood in the doorway and raised his hand slightly, just to confirm what he was seeing, and for a fraction of a second, the reflection didn't follow. It lagged, not like a glitch, not like a distortion, just delayed. Then it corrected itself, perfectly, as if nothing had happened. He repeated the motion, slower this time, watching carefully. The same result. a delay so slight it could be dismissed, if it hadn't happened more than once. Another officer stepped in beside him, watching from a different angle. The reflection aligned for him at first. Then it didn't, just for a moment. And then it did again. That's when they stopped treating it as coincidence. One of them shifted his focus away from the mirror, scanning the rest of the room. And that's when he saw the chair, positioned in the far corner, facing the wall, empty in the room itself, but not in the reflection. The official report ends before that detail is fully described. It cuts off midsection, transitioning into a summary that removes all references to the mirror entirely. But in the handwritten notes, the ones that weren't meant to be finalized, the description continues, brief, incomplete, but enough to understand why it was removed. The chair, as seen in the mirror, was occupied, not clearly, not in a way that could be easily defined, but there was something there, something seated facing away, positioned exactly where nothing existed in the physical room. And just below that note, written in smaller lettering, almost as an afterthought, subject does not align with officer presence. Up to that point, everything I had seen could still be explained away. Poor documentation, misinterpretation, stress responses. Not convincing explanations, but possible ones. That changed when I found the reference to Annex B. It didn't appear where it should have. Not attached to the report. Not listed in the file index. Just a single line, buried at the very end of the closure summary. See Annex B, restricted. No context. No follow-up. No indication of what it contained. And more importantly, no annex. That's when the case stopped feeling incomplete and started feeling edited. I went back through the archive system manually. Not the surface-level records, the internal indexing used for storage tracking. Every document has a sequence. Every attachment is logged, even if it's restricted. And in this case, the sequence didn't match. There was a break, a missing entry between two unrelated files. Not a corrupted file, not an unreadable record, a deliberate gap. And based on the numbering, there was only one thing it could have been. Annex B had existed, it had been logged, and then it had been removed, cleanly enough that the system still recognized something was missing, but not what it was. I didn't find the annex itself, but I found something adjacent to it, something that wasn't supposed to be stored separately, but had been overlooked. A reference log from a secondary review department. These logs don't contain the actual evidence. They list what was reviewed, categorized, and either archived or restricted. It's the kind of document no one thinks to erase, because on its own, it doesn't show anything. But in this case, it showed enough. There were 3 entries tied to room 307, all marked as visual documentation, all marked as restricted, and none of them included in the main file. The first entry was simple. Image 1, entry view, no visible subject. That alone didn't mean much. Standard procedure. Establish the condition of the room. The second entry was more specific. Image 2, mirror reflection discrepancy. That phrasing matched what I had already seen in the handwritten notes. It confirmed that whatever the officers had observed had been photographed, documented, reviewed, and then removed. But it was the third entry that made everything else harder to ignore, because it wasn't complete. It stopped mid-description, as if whoever wrote it didn't finish, or wasn't allowed to. Image 3, subject seated, facing. And then nothing. No continuation, no correction, just a line beneath it, added later, removed from file per directive. I read that line multiple times, not because it was confusing, but because of how direct it was. There was no attempt to rephrase it, no neutral language, no procedural justification, just removal. That's not how standard cases are handled. Even restricted material is catalogued, referenced, contained. It isn't erased, not unless the content itself creates a problem by existing. And at that point, I stopped asking what was missing and started asking why it had to be removed at all. I went back to the earlier statements after that. The guest's call, the mirror, the chair, the figure that didn't align, and one detail that hadn't felt significant before suddenly became impossible to ignore. They look like me. That wasn't just fear. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. And if the third image showed a subject seated, facing something, then the implication becomes harder to dismiss. Because the chair in the room was facing the wall, but the chair in the reflection wasn't empty. Which means whatever was captured in that image wasn't just present. It was positioned, intentional, and possibly aware of being observed. I thought I had reached the limit of what could be recovered. No annex, no complete report. Just fragments that suggested something had happened without ever fully describing it. But the last document I found wasn't part of the case file at all. It was stored separately, inside a maintenance archive. Routine inspection logs that had no direct connection to investigations. That's what made it easy to miss. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because unlike the reports, this wasn't written to explain anything. It was written to record what had to be done next. The date on the log was January 14th, 2004, 2 days after the incident. The purpose was listed as standard: prepare room 307 for re-entry into service. The checklist was complete. Structural integrity verified. Electrical systems functional. No contamination, no damage, no reason to keep the room closed. On paper, it was ready to be used again. And that alone didn't make sense. Not after a missing person. Not after police involvement. Not after a restricted annex had been removed from the record. But the log didn't question it. It simply moved forward. Until the final line. A mirror replaced. That was it. No additional context. No explanation of damage. No mention of why it needed to be removed in the first place. Just a completed action, written the same way as every other routine task in the document. But when I cross-referenced it with everything else, the inconsistency became clear. Nowhere in the official report was the mirror listed as broken. Nowhere was it described as compromised. It was only ever described as incorrect. And yet, it was the only object in the entire room that was physically removed. I searched for disposal records after that. Standard procedure requires documentation when items are replaced, especially anything removed following a police investigation. But there was nothing. No inventory update, no transfer record, no indication of where the original mirror went. It wasn't archived, it wasn't logged, it wasn't even marked as discarded. It simply stopped existing in the system. And the more I looked at the timeline, the more that absence became the most important detail in the entire case. Because everything else could be questioned, misinterpreted, explained away. But that couldn't. The sequence doesn't break. It lines up too cleanly. The guest checks in, requests the room, calls at 2:13 a.m., reports someone inside, says they look like him. The door is locked from the inside. Security arrives. The room resists being opened. Police force entry. The room is empty. The mirror behaves inconsistently. A figure appears in the reflection that doesn't exist in the room. Photographs are taken. The annex is removed. The mirror is replaced. And then the case is closed, not resolved. Closed. As if the goal wasn't to explain what happened, but to contain it. That's when I stopped looking at this as a disappearance. Because if the room was empty, then there was nowhere for the guest to go. And if the only object that didn't behave correctly was the mirror, then the question changes. It's no longer about how he left. It's about where he could have been seen instead. Because whatever was captured in that third image, the one that was removed, was seated, facing something. And if the reports are even partially accurate, then it wasn't just a reflection that failed to match reality. It was something that existed within it. Something that didn't move when it should have. Something that corrected itself when observed. And something that at least once looked back. The Ashford Grand Hotel never reopened. There's no official statement explaining why. No record of structural failure. No legal dispute. No public investigation. It was simply closed, transferred, and eventually stripped down until almost nothing remained. Today, if you search for it, you'll find fragments, an outdated listing, a photograph taken from the highway, a mention in a forum thread that leads nowhere. But there's no complete record of what it was, or why it disappeared, and more importantly, there's no mention of room 307. Not in renovation documents, not in updated floor plans. It's as if that section of the building was removed from memory along with everything else. I went through every document I could access, every archived log, every misplaced record, every fragment that wasn't properly filed. And no matter how I tried to reconstruct the sequence, one detail refused to settle into place. The mirror wasn't broken, it wasn't damaged, it wasn't replaced because it failed. It was replaced because it showed something it shouldn't have. Something that couldn't be left in the room, and couldn't be left in the records. And whatever that third image captured, the one that was removed, was enough to justify erasing an entire part of the case. The guest said there was someone in the room. He said they were standing in the corner. He said they hadn't moved since he woke up. And then he said something that only appears once in the entire file, but connects everything that came after. They look like me. That isn't confusion. That isn't fear. That's recognition. And if the reflection didn't match immediately, if it corrected itself after being observed, then maybe it wasn't just reflecting what was in front of it. Maybe it was aligning, adjusting, replacing what it needed to in order to remain consistent. Because if the room was empty when the door was opened, then the person who made that call wasn't there anymore. And if the only place something didn't behave the way it should was in the reflection, then there's one possibility the report never addresses. Not directly, not officially, but it's there, in the gaps, in the removals, in the details that don't align. Maybe nothing ever entered room 307 that night. Maybe nothing ever left. Maybe the only mistake was looking at something that had already been looking back.